distinguished audience. We continue our conference with yet another very eminent person, Mr. Honorable Martin Cauchon, because I cannot I cannot pronounce properly Martin's family name when it is written with O and when it is written with AU. Mr. Cauchon was first elected to political office in October 1993 in federal riding of Outremont, Quebec. Throughout his distinguished political career, he held many pivotal cabinet positions, including as Secretary of State, Minister of National Revenue, Money, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, as well as Minister of Political Responsibility for Quebec. Through these ministerial portfolios, Mr. Cauchon has gained in-depth knowledge of a wide variety of issues, particularly in challenges corporations face in the context of knowledge-based economies. Prior to his political career, Mr. Cauchon practiced law in civil and commercial litigations, and he completed the master's degree in international business and legal studies in the University of Exeter in England. Please join me in inviting Mr. Cauchon to the podium.
Merci beaucoup. Ça fonctionne, oui? Ouais. Merci beaucoup. Briefly in French, Martin Cauchon était très bien prononcé. Parce que les gens qui parlent français ici savent bien que mon nom en français, it is, I would say, rather tricky business. Because if you don't pronounce it the right way, you're going to add me two legs. It runs faster, but we're not talking exactly about the same person. So well done. So I'm glad to be here, but I said just before I start, Martin Cauchon, we were telling President Kathleen earlier that she was the Jeanne d'Arc of her field of business today. Just would like to remind you, and the lady there, she's laughing because she knows what I'm going to say. The president of the so-called trial of Jeanne d'Arc happened to be a bishop, and his name was Pierre Cauchon. So am I related to Pierre Cauchon? I don't know. But I'm going to tell you this is a good example of cultural diplomacy. Jeanne d'Arc and Martin Cauchon, maybe he's my ancestor, I don't know. But both on the same stage, so this is a good example. This is a pretty good start. I just would like to thank Mark as well. Mark and his, we bumped into each other 2 minutes ago. We spoke on the phone. We're going to have the chance to speak to each other tonight. Mark and his team as well, because you're doing a fantastic work. I just believe that we don't see enough of what you're doing in our country, in the States as well, and in South America, because I believe actually with the global marketplace, with what's going on in the world, the only way forward, it is soft power, it is cultural diplomacy, because, too often, it is easy to get involved into conflict and war because you close your eyes, you don't want to pay attention, you don't want to learn, you don't want to discuss. And I believe what you're doing, actually, it's the roots of what should be the world, not only today, but moving forward. I was Minister of Revenue, Economic Development, and I've been working hard with those departments, but as well, one of the departments that I was involved was the Department of Justice, where, of course, I was very much recognized in Canada as my stand for human rights. And I'm going to be speaking briefly about that in my speech because, knowing that if they let me go ad lib, I'm going to be speaking 45 minutes. So they said you have a time frame of about 20 minutes. So I'm going to read a speech to make sure I keep the format. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And of course, I'm glad to be here. We live in a global world, and really, if there is a conflict somewhere, none of us can be and should be at peace. In that global world where it is so easy to focus on our differences and use them to build trenches, I see this bringing people organizations, and countries together, using the richness of those differences through communication, education, and leadership. The notion of cultural diplomacy is a very generous one, and I consider myself a product of that philosophy. Indeed, I was born in a small community located in the province of Quebec, Canada. I'm a French-speaking, Roman Catholic, with a very humble background, and if I'm here today, it is because my country, Canada, is embracing and celebrating differences. Of course, Canada is not perfect. There are tensions and disagreements in Canada, as in any other country in the world where policy problems persist. But with very few exceptions, and of course we can talk about, could spend hours talking about the question of the First Nations in the world, but in Canada we're far from being perfect, and there's still a lot to do with the First Nations. But with very few exceptions, we have managed to resolve those tensions peacefully and build one of the most culturally diverse bilingual countries in the world. Respecting the cultural values and principles of others has been crucial to resolving regional and linguistic differences in Canada. I have myself experienced that spirit of tolerance since I had the privilege of serving the Canadian people in different cabinet portfolios under former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, including Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. I was part of a government that valued pragmatic approach through discussions and diplomacy. That is why we decided not to be involved, for example, in the Iraq invasion, because it was not sanctioned by the United Nations, and because we had not yet exhausted all diplomatic effort. Of course, it was a difficult decision, and I'm just going to stop there and just to precise that when we look at the use of soft power and cultural diplomacy, it may look easy, may look relaxed compared to start fighting. But to take that course of action, which is cultural diplomacy, sometimes could be very, very difficult. And I remember when we as a government and we as a cabinet took the decision not to join the States, basically our ally at the time and still our ally, when you look as well about our economic development and the relationship that we have with the USA, it is still amazing. It is our best partner, our neighbor, and of course the relationship is still very good. But at the time when we took the decision, government afterwards, we were under tremendous pressure. Of course, from the States, they were not happy, and it's probably an understatement to tell you that they were not happy, but as well from the business community. Because of course, it's interesting, you guys in Ottawa are talking about soft power and using the United Nations and resolutions and all the blah, 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 but they were telling us, you know what, we've got businesses, we have employees, and because of the decision you took, essentially what's going to happen, we're going to lose a contract in Seattle. We're going to lose another contract in New York State. And in the end, we're going to have to lay off people. So when you are a government, you face such a situation, to stand up for principle, it is difficult. But I'm going to tell you something, based on my experience, it is always the right course of action to stand up for principle. Today, I do a lot of traveling to expand business opportunities with nations like, for example, China. And it always strikes me how people and businesses are being more interconnected every day. This trend will only continue and grow in importance. Indeed, even as we work to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, we cannot eliminate cultural differences. It is through cooperation, discussion, and of course, intellectual curiosity that we will get to know each other better, that we will use differences as a catalyst for peace. Throughout the centuries, most of the conflicts in the world, whether they were land-based, religious, or ethnic, to name a few, were generated by a lack of understanding of cultural values and a lack of willingness to learn, to reach out, and to try to understand others. In a world so closely connected by technology and social media, and yet so divided in other ways, we need leadership from countries with strong values respecting democracy and human rights. We need leadership from countries that have demonstrated the capacity to build consensus and to collectively support the decision once it is taken. A capacity to be a credible mediator in an international forum. Of course, Europe is a fantastic example of that. What you've achieved, you all together, is amazing and should be taken as an example to the world. Also, I believe Canada is one of those countries. This leadership approach in diplomacy is true to the spirit of one of our former Liberal Prime Minister, Lister B. Pearson, what today we call about the Pearsonian approach. Pearson was a former fighter pilot, a war veteran who devoted his political and diplomatic life to the cause of peace. He won the Nobel Peace Prize 55 years ago for his diplomatic vision, judgment, and perseverance in establishing an international policing presence to resolve the 1956 Suez crisis and conflict. Since then, Le Casque Bleu has become the symbol of the efforts to promote global peace and security. Building on that foundation, I was also proud of the efforts of my government at the time and my colleagues to establish a global treaty to ban landmines, often called and referred to as the Ottawa Treaty of 1997. Since the treaty was concluded 15 years ago, about 160 countries have signed on, and more than 44 million mines have been destroyed by members of the treaty. Just think about how many lives have been saved, how many children have been spared from being maimed by the efforts of governments and non-government organizations working together. To export those strong values, you need to implement them at home first. In other words, if you want to be credible in a global stage, if you want to get involved into a conflict and act as a mediator, you need to be credible. And to be credible means to have strong values at home, to be able to live according to those values. And of course, to illustrate that, let me briefly touch upon Canada's national unity debate. I was looking at the table next door right there, the Quebec flag, which is the flag of my province. And of course, this is the Canadian flag. I mean, thank you very much for doing that, by the way. I just don't know who's the organizer, but it was very nice. And of course, we've been facing the debate on unity since 1976, and it started even before. And that question of, the question of national unity today is timeless since Quebec has recently elected its first woman as premier, and that was welcome, but also she's the leader of the Parti Québécois, which is indeed, as we all know, a separatist party. Since 1976, the year of the election of the first sovereignist government in Quebec, the way we handled it is through discussion, political compromise, and the use of course, democratic tools. We went through, since 1976, we went through, I guess, 3 referendums. 2 referendums on the separation of Quebec, and 1 referendum talking basically about reorganizing the Constitution of Canada, and none of them were successful so far. As an example, to tell you how tolerant the Canadian people are, as an example, it is difficult to find other countries in the world where members of a regional sovereignist party would have seats in the national parliament. And that's what happened in Canada since the beginning of the 90s, to be more precise, since 1993, where we have a separatist party sitting at the national government and basically acting and making representation for the separation of the province of Quebec. And of course, another good example, find another country in terms of being peaceful, find another country where a sovereignty referendum is defeated by less than 1%, and yet the next day, people go back to work and go about their business peacefully, respecting the result. That is indeed Canada. That is the country I love, and a country where the words compromise and consensus are deeply, deeply rooted. Another good example is a debate I led, since I'm pretty much seen as the father of that legislation. Another good example is same-sex marriage, a political change that I led as Canadian Justice Minister. This was a very, very divisive issue, that evoked strong emotion on both sides, and that was involving two fundamental rights protected by our Canadian Charter of Rights. Of course, on one hand, the equality right, and on the other hand as well, the right for the religious belief. I strongly believe in equality for all people, and that is why I decided to fight for the rights of gays and lesbians to marry. After much discussions and debate, Canada became one of the first countries to have adopted a law that makes equal marriage legal, while at the same time, that is important, while at the same time respecting religious belief. And just a few words about that. I remember when I started the debate, people thought that I was a bit crazy. I was a young politician. I was 39 years old, one of the youngest justice ministers we had. And I told Prime Minister at the time, I said, Prime Minister, you've decided to have a young Minister of Justice. So, and of course, Mr. Chrétien was much older. So I said, sir, you're going to have to cope with the fact that a young Minister of Justice means different values, values of my generation, basically. He wasn't really on side at the beginning, of course, but because he was a statesman, in the end, he was on side. And when we started the debate, the first poll, to the best of my recollection, 62% of the people, of the Canadian people, opposed my vision. And it really through traveling, discussion, forum, discussing, debating, that in the end we were able to achieve what we've been able to achieve. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. There's some places where I got, delivering my speech, and the RCMP, which is the police in Canada, they had to bring me back. I mean, they had to bring me outside the room through the back door because people were fighting in the room. That was a tough, tough debate. I've heard very difficult stuff in there, stuff that I won't repeat. But in the end, you know what? Notwithstanding the fact that it was difficult, we have enacted that bill, and the day after, people respected the decision. And years after today, we don't even talk about that. It is business as usual. And I'm going to tell you something. I was very proud, and I know I have a very short period of time, but I was very proud when one day when my son came back home at night, and he sat with me for dinner and looked at me and he said, Dad, he said, we spoke about your bill today. I said, what do you mean? Yeah, he said, you know, he said, the same-sex bill. I said, okay. I said, and what did you say? But he said, we just don't understand why it was so difficult to pass that bill. You know what? That was a great day. Because I gave gays and lesbians in Canada what I call equality according to law. But the real equality is what I call social acceptance. The day you're going to be gay and lesbian and people are not going to look at you because of your sexual orientation, but they're going to look at you because first, you're a human being, you're a professional with capacity. And what my son told me made me proud because I realized that with the new generation, we're getting there. So see, another good example that tells you that to stand for principle, it's the only way forward. What I went through was tough as a minister, but today, you know what? They don't even talk about that. It is business as usual. So indeed, I'm very proud of that achievement, and I will keep working to make sure we get to a place of social and economic equality. Why? Because in the end, we are building a better place to live, indeed, a better country, and of course, a better world. Cultural diplomacy is about celebrating diversity, promoting human rights, peace, and stability through dialogue. In Canada, for example, immigration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity. Immigrants have enriched our country and are helping to build our economy while making it one of the most diverse in the world. We embrace and celebrate differences. To paraphrase former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, in Canada, we welcome the richness of your values, background, and experiences. I invite you to participate in the building process of our country around the constitutional values to be found in our Canadian Charter of Rights. So this is Canada. I believe that Canada should continue to play an important role as a soft power because more than ever, it is through soft power that we will succeed. I prefer negotiations over bullets. Yet, today it is hard to recognize my country in the approach the current government is taking to diplomacy. Under the existing government, Canada has veered from its path of peacemaker. They have pulled out of the Kyoto Agreement and abandoned Canada's leadership role on the environment. They have cut programs that supported cultural exports and no longer pursue the consensus-building approach that has helped in reaching negotiated settlements to regional conflicts. Over the past few weeks, we've seen tension escalating between Palestinians and Israelis. Traditionally, Canada has been a voice for reason and compromise. Unfortunately, our government has abandoned that approach, and this has not been helpful in bringing the two sides back to the negotiating table. Today, indeed, Canada lacks a good Middle East policy. We need to get back on track because this approach is affecting Canada's reputation at the international level. We can either follow the path of Prime Minister Stephen Harper or get back to the moderate approach of Lister B. Pearson of Jean Chrétien. For me, the choice is pretty obvious. The world is complex. Countries are often divided by regional, cultural, religious, ethnic, and linguistic differences. I strongly believe the only way forward is the pragmatic approach of building consensus, of bringing people together, of indeed cultural diplomacy. Let me add another aspect to our discussion today. We cannot ignore the idea of economic diplomacy as well. We also need to find ways to bridge the economic gap between the have and the have-not globally because political security and economic security go hand in hand. We need to provide the tools for developing countries to become self-sufficient because this benefits us all. In Canada, as in many other countries, the middle class is slipping and the gap between rich and poor is growing. We need policies that promote economic growth that benefit everyone. We also need to ensure that all countries have a voice to international stage and not just the rich and powerful ones. Let me close with the words of one of the most prominent voices for cultural diplomacy, Bono, who once said, "The world needs more Canada." Let us hope that Canada soon finds its way back to a foreign policy that brings more Canadian-style consensus building to the world. Thank you to all the sponsors. And again, always remember, when you fight for principle, it's always the right decision. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank
Take this one right there. This one works. Okay. Promise.
Mr. Cauchon, we will keep you for a few more moments until we wait for the president of Burundi. And if you are prepared, we may take some questions from the audience.
If it's too tough a question, I will reply through the postal stream.
Political way. You are going
you a
to
letter.
reply. As an experienced politician, you will answer as a politician.
You know what?
Let's begin with this one. Yeah, okay.
Hello, Kathy Baldwin, University of Oxford, UK. My question was, I wondered with the legalisation of gay and lesbian marriage in Canada, how the religious requirements and the equality requirements were amalgamated, as they were, because at the moment in the UK we're going through a similar debate in Parliament. There's already a law that allows lesbian and gay couples to marry on a civil basis, but at the moment there's a massive debate and legal wrangling over whether or not they should be allowed to have religious marriages. Our national state church, the Church of England, has asked to not be forced to provide legal marriages in churches because there's too much disagreement about that among the Church of England. So a law has just been passed that exempts the Church of England from holding those marriages, but other more liberal religious groups, some elements of Judaism, Quakers, and other churches are fine and happy to do that. So I wondered how those two perspectives were reconciled and what the final agreement was in Canada.
That is indeed the fundamental question, and if you're giving me an hour, I will take the time to answer. No, I take 5 minutes though. Yeah, I try to do my best, but it's a very complex question that she's raising. First of all, what we were facing at the time, we used to call that what we call the judicial activism, is that politicians normally don't have the backbone to take over tough issues like that, which is a social issue, and they let the court proceed. And what happened, I was Justice Minister, and the Court of Appeal in Ontario decided that the classic definition of marriage was illegal. And of course, all my colleagues in caucus looked at me and they said, Martin, you're going to let it go to the Supreme Court. And I said, there's no way I'm going to let it go because I believe that the court is right, and I believe we should legalize same-sex marriage. And one of the toughest part of the debate was, I was facing two fundamental rights, equality and religious belief. But just bear in mind that marriage is first and foremost, it is a civil institution. So when you get married, you're gonna sign something we call the registry. This is a civil institution, and then after, it is a religious institution. In other words, it's not because it is not religious that it's not a marriage. So what we did, and I was telling that as well to the religious group across Canada, I said, you know what, you're not going to be forced to solemnize same-sex marriage because it's against your belief. And they were telling me, we don't believe you, they're going to force us. So what I did, I crafted a bill there was 2 or 3 articles in the bill. One is to legalize the civil marriage, which is the basic marriage. And the other one, we say basically that a religious institution cannot be forced to solemnize. In other words, the beauty of that is that we will never have to go back to in reopening the bill, because if you decide, like, if you're a religious organization and you decide that it's okay, you can solemnize same-sex marriage, you do it. You're not stopped from doing it. But on the other hand, you cannot be forced as well because we respect religious belief. This is a good example of what I call a sort of Canadian consensus approach.
Thank you very much. Yes, but these are not working again. Yes, okay. Did you want to ask the question?
I have
yes.
Small question.
And small question and small answer, because there are other people who would like to take the floor.
Yeah. How did you deal with the question of adopting children?
I didn't. I didn't deal with it. The reason why is that according to our Canadian Constitution, I was responsible for the institution of marriage, but I wasn't. The adoption belongs to the province, and so provinces have dealt with the question of adoption on a province-per-province basis. So that's the short answer. But I'll tell you afterwards what they've done, though.
Okay, thank you very much for the speech. I will be very short as well. Yes, my name is Cauchon. I'm professor at Institute for Cultural Diplomacy as well, postdoc at John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies with a certain focus on Quebec, Canada, environmental justice. So my quick question is, since you are professional in justice matters in Canada, and you may see my critical question as a concern for my field, which I'm going to visit next year, what kind of approaches have you or have the government taken, in particular in Quebec, to allow dialogue, diplomatic dialogue with the indigenous people with regards to the environmental question?
That is I hope you're going to be around, because that is a very complex question. Because the reality is, when I was part of government, we were facing a separatist government. They were a majority separatist government, and their game plan was pretty obvious. In other words, they just wanted to have a referendum on separation. So we got involved into that discussion, and we faced back 1995 or 96, so we faced a referendum, and that's the one that was really a close call, and people went back to work the day after with no, no discussion. They have accepted the result. But lately what happened, I believe one of the biggest problems we've had is that since 1976, the province of Quebec used to get around the table of the Federation asking for more. Quebec was a pretty strong province, and they were asking jurisdiction to the Canadian government, but all the time they were the only one mostly asking for something more. So they were feeling very isolated at the time. But today, when you look at Canada, You have provinces like Ontario, BC, Alberta, the Atlantic provinces as well. They are growing, and of course, they're more mature. So Quebec is not alone anymore. And that's the reason why the former Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, has established what we call the Council of the Federation, whereby provinces now work together to create a counterbalance to the Canadian government. So it makes the provinces stronger. And when now you speak about the question of the federation of the Constitution, Quebec is not alone. So in other words, they feel more part of a sort of family. And as well, I believe the Canadian government should have what we call asymmetrical approach vis-a-vis the provinces. You know what? It's such a big country. You see differences from one province to another. You're going to be able to adapt without giving away jurisdictions that you need in order to keep the country and the fabric together. So this is where I am with my approach, shortly. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to listen to a very prominent person,